Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me for a conversation with artist Karen Ann Hoffman, hosted at the New York State Museum. My name is Gwen Saul, and I'm the curator of cultural anthropology and a steward of the museum's ethnographic collections that illustrate the histories and lived experiences of Indigenous peoples whose ancestral territories lie within what is now New York State. The New York State Museum is located in Albany, New York, a city built on the ancestral lands of the Mohi-Koniok, people of the waters that are never still, Munsee-speaking Mohicans, and I'm grateful for the continuous active presence and work of members of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation here in this region, stewarding their ancestral lands and material culture. This region is also homeland territory to Ganengahaga, people of the Flint or Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, who maintain close connection to these lands as a significant part of their histories. So it is with deep and abiding gratitude to Indigenous peoples of this land, past, present, and future, that I welcome you to learn more about the work of Karen Ann Hoffman. And towards the latter half of our conversation, we'll be joined by another artist, Don Darkmountain, who collaborated with Karen Ann on an artwork in our collection that addresses one of the most critical issues in Indian country today. For those of you joining us and learning about Karen Ann Hoffman for the first time, she is Zooming with us today from the Eiteljorg Museum in Indiana, where she is currently holding a residency. She is a member of the Oneida Nation in what is now Wisconsin, located on Menominee and Ho-Chunk lands. Her artwork and studies focus on the history and practices of Haudenosaunee or Iroquois raised beadwork. She earned a master's degree in human development from the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point, completing a thesis titled Iroquois Raised Beadwork as a Symbol of Cultural Identity. In addition to being an artist, a researcher, a mentor, a fantastic friend, she's also a curator, and her curatorial work has included exhibits at the Wisconsin History Museum and the Neville History Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And she's received numerous awards for her work, and most recently, proving that 2020 has not been a year entirely full of bad news, and much to everyone's delight, she is the well-deserved recipient of a prestigious National Heritage Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. So her artwork can be found in the collections of the Eiteljorg Museum, the State Museum of Wisconsin, the National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian, at our neighboring institution, the Iroquois Indian Museum, the Field Museum in Chicago, where her work will be featured in a newly renovated gallery on Indigenous art. And we are so very lucky to have her work in the New York State Museum collections. And you will see some of that today, actually all of it. You'll see all of her work today in the New York State Museum collections. So Karen Ann, thank you so much for graciously taking time to be with me today and to talk with us.
I could not be more pleased. Thank you, Gwen, for having me and for having Dawn a little bit later in our conversation. And thank you for all the good work that you and your colleagues at the New York State Museum do in caretaking the legacy pieces of art that you are responsible for. We really appreciate it.
Well, you and Dawn and so many other artists are the inspiration for taking care of it and for doing this work. So it's a pleasure and an honor.
It's a great partnership. Thanks.
It's a great partnership. So I thought we would start with what is raised beadwork? For those of us joining in this conversation who aren't quite sure or familiar with it, tell us what it is and what makes this art form so unique.
Iroquois raised beadwork is a cultural hallmark for the Haudenosaunee. Its forms and its designs reach back 10 12, 14,000 years. It is the material expression of an unbroken chain of art, culture, and community that stretches from the ancestors in our past, is expressed by the incredible talent in our present, and lays the table for those whose faces we have yet to see. And what I think is really incredibly interesting about Haudenosaunee art is that it exists in all three of these time frames at the same moment. That, to me, is extremely powerful. So raised beadwork is the current material expression of all of that culture. It's done with some really simple materials, Gwen. Really all you need is a nice needle, steel is great, some cotton thread, a bit of beadwax. I prefer Czechoslovakian glass beads, a scrap of cloth, velvet if you can find it, and a connection to your ancestors, to your current familiar friends, and a thought for the future. Those simple materials come together to produce raised beadwork.
Can you see the picture of the strawberry? I'm just curious because all I see is the conversation.
I see the black screen that says a conversation with Karen Ann and featuring Dawn.
I just want to make sure that the next slide gets shown so people understand your beautiful description, but also see the beautiful strawberry that you did that I'm looking at, but I don't know anyone else can see.
Well, let me see if I can describe it. If I were writing a label for that, I would say that they are red and green, transparent Czechoslovakian glass beads. Ah, there they are. There they are. They're expressed on a watercolor done by Dawn Dark Mountain. The thing that's different about raised beadwork is it is just exactly that, Gwen. It's raised, it's three-dimensional. It's a style of beadwork that stands proud above the substrate, whatever that is, that the beads are sewn to.
I think that's what makes it so interesting. As someone who isn't as familiar with raised beadwork, it just has this immediate texture to it.
And right, that dimensionality is really characteristic. Of course, I mean, that's in the word, it's raised beadwork, but it's really exclusive to the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee. Although you find glass beads gifted by the colonizers wherever they went on whatever continents they visited, and you find steel needles, and you find good thread, and you find cloth. You do find indigenous people handling these self-same materials all across the globe, but you only find raised beadwork coming from the hands of the Haudenosaunee. That's our cultural hallmark, one of them anyway.
And that seems like a really important point too. In more recently, thinking about some of the lectures that Tuscarora scholar Jolene Rickard has been giving, and she talks about thinking about Haudenosaunee raised beadwork as really marking a landscape and a territory where Haudenosaunee people worked and lived and traveled. And that seemed like a really beautiful way of rethinking how we commemorate or memorialize the landscape to have this beautiful art form.
I wouldn't argue with her premise one little bit. I do agree that this is distinctive, and I do agree that it's distinctive for us. What I think is interesting about what you just said, Gwen, is that she uses the words marking our landscape. It's my particular thought these days that environment is the basic building block of any culture, because it's the environment that provides the raw materials for our housing, for our clothing, for our food, for how we raise our families. The environment provides and defines and delineates every aspect of a culture. And so I think then that environment produces culture. And I think that artwork expresses that culture. So we're born in the eastern woodlands. That creates that abundance, that generosity, that exuberance for life that is the eastern woodlands, obviously is expressed then by our art forms. So I love the connection between art and environment and culture. I think they cannot be separated.
No, it doesn't seem like that in this case, and that, working with that art form today is yet another expression of reaffirming that connection.
I think that's true. And I think that although across the millennia, the materials that we have had to create our artwork have certainly changed. I mean, the oldest pieces of Haudenosaunee artwork that I've personally seen have been at the Royal Ontario Museum and at your fine institution. And in places like that, I see shell gorgets that are thousands of years old. I see them shaped like turtles. I see scratched into ancient pieces of rock, double curved designs decorated with individual dots. I see those motifs expressed across the millennia through different materials. Now we're privileged to have such easy access to beautiful beads, that we can use them to express this long lineage of culture.
And I can't even imagine the decision process of choosing colors and styles of beads.
For me, Gwen, it's so easy. And I'll tell you why it's easy. It's easy because I think as an artist, for me, I get to make one choice. I get to choose which tradition I'm going to spend the next 6, 9, 12, 18 months with. I choose that. And in this case, Dawn and I together chose this strawberry as a way of expressing what we'll talk about later. So once the choice of the strawberry is made, the decisions about color are made. Once I decide what tradition to express, the tradition chooses the colors, the designs, the forms, the shapes. The tradition is in charge. My job is to get the heck out of the way and just hold the needle.
Well, speaking of beads and tradition, I'm going to skip ahead to the next slide here because
Yeah.
so what everyone is looking at is the Tree of Peace by a Cayuga beadwork artist named Sam Thomas. And he was greatly inspired by and worked very closely with his mother, Lorna Hill. And when I look at the New York State Museum Contemporary Native Art Collection, which includes work by two of your mentors, Karen Ann, Sam Thomas, and Lorna Hill, his mom, I'm really struck by the meaningful role of mentorship when it comes to art making in communities. And so would you share with us how you came to meet Sam and how you think of mentorship and connection within the larger Haudenosaunee beadwork community?
I have been so fortunate to have really strong and really generous mentors, and chief among them are Samuel Thomas and his mom, the late Lorna Hill. So if you've got time for a bit of a story, back in the 70s and 80s in Wisconsin as an Indian girl, I was doing what all my girlfriends were doing, making kind of, pan-Indian beaded little things, little earrings. And, if you had a man, you beaded a cap for him and you made a daisy chain bracelet. I mean, and it was perfectly satisfying to me. It was all I cared to do and all I cared about. And it was fine. It wasn't that pivotal. in my life. But one day I was sitting at home and I opened our tribal newspaper, the Galloway-Sucks, and in there was an advertisement, and that advertisement said, "Come to Oneida, workshop in raised beadwork by Samuel Thomas and Lorna Hill." And I wasn't really interested because I really wasn't a beader, but the husband, he said, "You should go. You should go. You should learn something about your traditions. You should learn something about your art forms. You should go." And I must say, it's a 2-hour drive one way from where I lived to where the workshop was being held. And I wasn't a beater and I wasn't that excited, but because the husband encouraged me, I went. I took that first workshop from Samuel Thomas and his mom, Lorna Hill, and I fell in love. I fell in love with the beadwork. I fell in love with the style. I fell in love with Lorna Hill. I fell in love with Samuel Thomas. And for no good reason on this earth, they took me under their wings like a little lost puppy. They showed faith in me that I didn't even have in myself. They took me into their hearts. They took me into their homes. I learned so much from Lorna and from Sam and from Beverly as well. Beverly Thomas, Sam's sister. I learned from them not just how to bead, which is not technically difficult, but why to bead. And that, in my view, is the harder part. I learned a lot of different lessons from Lorna and from Samuel and from Beverly over the decades that we spent together. But one of the most pivotal for me is something I learned from Lorna. She told me one time, Karen Ann, your beadwork is pretty. I was just doing workshop items and, I was finally learning how to thread that needle, and I was finally kind of getting the idea of how to do good needle placement and copy the designs that Samuel and Lorna and Beverly were sharing with me. And she said, "It's nice, your work is pretty and that's nice," she said, "but pretty is not enough." She told me, pretty is like being a pretty girl. I mean, it'll get you in the room. It'll do that. But if that's all you got is pretty, you really haven't got that much. And so it was through those kinds of conversations that I learned that the why of beading is more important. It was through watching as Samuel created some of the things like you're showing on this screen that I learned that the why of beading is so pivotal. That's the power of a needle and thread. That's the power of a little tiny piece of glass. That's the transmission of culture from one generation to the next, existing simultaneously in time. This piece, this Tree of Peace from 2014, talks about every Haudenosaunee that ever has been, that is now, and that ever will be. This piece reaches the hearts of all of us, as well as sharing cultural content with folks not from our community. This is what I learned from mentorship. This is the example which I strive to come up to. I am so grateful for the teachers that have come my way and the patience that they have shown me and the generosity with which they have treated me, that I cannot begin to express the importance of a really good mentor. Now, if I may, I'll say that I've had a couple of other mentors in my life. Another one was James G. Frechette Jr., a Menominee artist of some high renown, a carver, in fact. And like Lorna told me, pretty is good, but pretty is not enough. I remember Jim sitting me down one day, decades ago. He said, "So, Karen Ann, you think you want to be an artist, huh?" And I was like, yeah, Jim, I think I do, I think I do want that. And what he told me was, well, my girl, it's going to be a painful life. And I didn't understand what he meant at the time. But as I grew, as I developed, as my world unfolded in front of me, I began to see some of what James G. Frechette was telling me. So I've had mentors who have encouraged me to be the best that I possibly can be because it stands not for me, but for all of us. And mentors who have told me very clearly that that is not the easiest path in the world. I was really fortunate to be instructed in both of those lessons early in my career.
Well, and it seems like you've really taken those lessons to heart and run with it. Your beadwork, this piece, Treaty Footstool, right? I feel like it has such a strong voice, and it takes this gorgeous art form of raised beadwork and really has something to say about contemporary issues going on, and almost takes on a real activist role. So I guess tell us about Treaty Footstool, and I have some close-ups that I'll share too.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Well, you already said that I'm Oneida from the state of Wisconsin. Um, I was born and raised here in the state of Wisconsin. And in the 1980s, Wisconsin lived through what we called the Walleye Wars. And what the Walleye Wars were goes back a little ways in history. So other resident tribes in the state of Wisconsin include the Ojibwe people, the Chippewas. And when the Chippewas signed their treaties with the state of Wisconsin and the federal government ratified those treaties, they reserved the right to hunt, fish, and gather outside of their ceded territories so that they could continue to feed their families. In the 80s and so on, the Chippewa, I won't say took advantage, but they expressed those treaty rights. So they went spearing for walleyes. And that engendered some of the most hateful and difficult times in Wisconsin in my life to that point. Cries of save a walleye, spear an Indian were rampant in the north woods of Wisconsin. I lived in central Wisconsin. I'm an Oneida person. I don't have those treaty rights. My husband, a Menominee and Ottawa descendant, didn't have those treaty rights, but the neighbors didn't seem to make that distinction. And so there were nasty things written on the road in front of my house, and somehow our truck had a bullet hole in its windshield, and somehow a dead cat found its way into our mailbox, and that was the Walleye Wars. So as a reaction to that, I thought about what my Haudenosaunee elders had to say about fish and water. And what they say is to be mindful and thankful for the waters that give us life, and to be mindful and thankful for the fishes that not only clean those waters, but give up their very bodies so that we, as Haudenosaunee people, may live. And I thought about that in connection to the contemporary walleye wars that were going on. And I could not, in my mind, coincide the two sides, one of whom was only trying to feed their families and take care of the waters, and the other side, which thought that that was an assault on something. I'm not sure which. So to explore that idea, I took our Thanksgiving address and our prayer, and I surrounded this beaded walleye with all the love that generations of Haudenosaunee people could muster. I beaded that walleye so that it would be the best biological representation of a walleye that I could muster. I even went so far as to visit a taxidermist, which was no small feat in those days for an Indian person to walk into a taxidermist's office and get a hold of the kind of an eye that was used to mount trophy walleye by non-native fisher persons at that time. And so the eye in this walleye represents that bit of conversation. Thanks. The treaty footstool is executed on a cast iron footstool that probably dates from the 1880s, that probably would have been present in a Victorian home. So I tried to combine contemporary issues, ancient culture, and a bit of the Victorian influence, which holds historically some of the high points of Haudenosaunee raised beadwork. It resulted in Treaty Rights Footstool, who has found a home, thankfully, at the New York State Museum, where he can tell his story to way more people than I would ever be able to provide for. So I'm grateful to you, Gwen, for giving him a home. Thank you.
Well, we absolutely love this piece. And has the issue more or less resolved? With the,
Well, you think it's gone away, and then springtime comes and it rears its ugly head. I shouldn't joke. There was a shooting at a boat landing this spring during walleye spearing times. So although I'd like to say it went away and this time nobody went to the hospital, the hostility still resonates in the undercurrents of Wisconsin's boat landings. It's very sad.
well, that makes this piece really an important statement, I think, on all of us needing to do a better job of getting along and respecting who has been here far longer on these lands. And that
And keeping the promises that we make to one another, right? I mean, at one point, somebody said, yeah, give me your land, you can still have a fish. I mean, when you agree, you agree.
Well, moving on, I want to introduce everyone to another animal. This is our most recent acquisition, Bernard the Buzzard Bag. And he's just so gorgeous. He just had glamour shots taken not too long ago. And I'm so thrilled to have this piece of yours in the collection. So
I'm
tell us about
I'm so thrilled that Bernard has a home. I'm so happy for him. Thank you. Yeah.
So what's the story behind Bernard?
Okay, all right. I'm delighted to tell this. So the early inspiration for Bernard the Buzzard Bag was that my husband and we lived, I still live, in a rural area outside of central Wisconsin. And so we have to drive into town for groceries and gas and that kind of thing. And then one particular summer, as we were driving, we were noticing that there were a lot of buzzards, just beautiful buzzards, feasting on the dead raccoons and the rabbits and stuff on our roadside. And we really enjoyed driving to town and coming up close to those buzzards. And then they'd fly away with their big, beautiful wings. And we just thought they were marvelous. And one September day, we were driving into town and the buzzard didn't get up and fly away. And we thought, oh dear, something must be wrong. We pulled over and that poor buzzard, he just stayed on the ground. And so my husband got out of the car and he moved that poor buzzard off the side of the road into the cooler grasses. And we thought he was going to die. We went into town for groceries and we came back and we thought we'd stop and take a look at that dead buzzard. And as we pulled over, he flapped one wing, and I told my Mike to get out, and actually what I said was put him out of his misery. And Mike got out of the car and he said that bird looked up at him with one eye, flapped one wing, and he couldn't do the deed. So what we did instead was we called a raptor recovery center. We put Bernard in the back of the car. We drove him 100 miles and we delivered him to REGI, Reggie, the recovery center. And unfortunately, Bernard did not survive the weekend. Internal injuries from a car is what they figured. But I never really forgot about Bernard. One day, about 5 seasons later, the husband and I were taking a walk around our 40-acre property, and it was a beautiful September afternoon, just bright and blue and just gorgeous. I looked up in the sky, and it was one of those days where the sun is out, but the moon's out at the same time in the middle of the day. And in between that sun and that moon, there was this amazing buzzard flying around, and I immediately remembered Bernard. And I thought to myself, I guess that's Bernard and he wants me to beat him. So I remembered the tradition about the story about how the birds got their feathers. And that story features the buzzard and his particular responsibility and his particular role and the help that he gets from deer in accomplishing his mission to ask if the birds might have clothing. In that story, Bernard, he flies up and he flies up so high in the sky that he gets so close to the sun that it burns his head. And they say that that story is true because look at Buzzard. His head is still red today from being burned by that sun. So I put that sun on that bag. I gave Bernard that red head. I decorated this bag with those toes of that deer, which were a gift from a friend of mine, Julia Marden, and her man, Chris. They sent those to me from the East Coast because in the story, deer gives up his life so that Bernard, the buzzard, does not have to take time to hunt and he can concentrate on his responsibilities to the bird community. So we put those deer toes on there to make those tassels. I used gold in here for the sun for a couple of reasons, because typically Native people don't spend a lot of time worrying about gold. But in this particular case, those were a gift from Samuel Thomas. He and his mom had done some important work on power of place and strength of being, and they had visited power places around the world. And among those places, they visited the pyramids. And although, as I've said, Native people often don't work in gold, the Egyptians sure do. And so the work that Sam and his mom were inspired to do out of that trip to Egypt included golden beads. And when Sam came back, he handed me a handful of these 14-karat gold beads. And he said, well, maybe someday you'll do something nice. Who knows? So he gave me those beads. I hung on to them for 6 or 8 years. And the story of Bernard the buzzard and that beautiful sun up in the sky, our elder brother, the sun, I thought that's the perfect use for these golden beads. You had asked me earlier, Gwen, how I make the choices for color, and I had said that I don't. And this is a perfect example of that. I don't choose that Bernard is a black buzzard. He is a black buzzard. I know, though, from looking at a black buzzard that there are a lot of different kinds of black in his wings and his feathers and his body. And so I used 6 different kinds of black beads in his body to execute the reality of the differences of black in the feathers of a buzzard. I used red because his head is red. I used black because those are the right colors. I used gold. I outlined him in gold because the elder brother, the sun, shines on him. I don't make these choices. The tradition makes these choices. My job is to try to understand the tradition as well as I can so that I don't make mistakes, so that in 200 years, when somebody comes to your museum and visits with Bernard, I've given him everything he needs to convey his tradition to whatever audience comes, to have a conversation with him.
Well, the different beads just add so much life and texture to him. I mean, he is almost flying off of the bandolier bag, you know?
I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased. That makes me want to say this about not every piece of beadwork that I produce, but I do spend a lot of time with certain pieces, 6 months, 9 months, a year, sometimes more than a year. And I consider those pieces to be what I call legacy pieces. And those pieces, I do believe, are imbued with an animacy, with a life that will far outstretch my own. So I'm glad that he's flying on that velvet.
So while we were talking, we were joined by our esteemed guest. Hello, Dawn.
Hello.
Good morning, Dawn.
Good morning. Is there a way to see everybody at once? I don't see that on here. Well, that's all right. You can see me, right?
Yes, I can. Yes,
Okay. All right.
From thousands of miles away.
I know we're spread out all over the country here. It's good to see you both.
Virtual hugs, Dawn.
Yes.
So for those of us, or for our audience joining us, I just would like to briefly mention that Dawn Dark Mountain is also a member of the Oneida Nation, Wisconsin, although she currently resides in Tewa lands in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and that she has an equally storied and notable art career, and primarily works with watercolors. And the New York State Museum is very fortunate to have her watercolor series, Treaty Calico, which honors the Treaty of Canandaigua, signed on November 11th, 1794 by representatives of the Six Nations and the United States. And if you are interested to learn more about that, please go to social media, Facebook or Instagram, to Ganondagan Historic Site. I believe they are directing folks to see a virtual commemoration of the signing of the Treaty of Canandaigua online this year at 2 p.m. tomorrow. So if you're curious to learn more about that, please take my suggestion and do so. But welcome, Dawn. We're so happy to have you here.
Nice to be here. Nice to see you after all this time.
So Karen Ann, is there anything else you wanted to say about Bernard before we move on?
No, just that it's a great pleasure to see him again, and thank you for caretaking him. And I'm excited that so many people will now have a chance to visit with Bernard. Thank you.
This comes to mind really briefly, actually. The bandolier bag is really important, is it not, for thinking about the histories of adornment and accessories for Indigenous peoples? And I think it's something that you see, you know, as far south as Seminole people, and certainly here in the East Coast area and woodlands. So was it a conscious choice to choose that style of bag for this work?
It was a conscious choice to choose the bandolier bag because I like to work in big objects with a big canvas, shall we say. But what I did also do was try to research the different styles of bandolier bags that are associated with these communities, as you say. So there's a Western Great Lakes style of bandolier bag, which is very square. As you move east, you start to see that the shape of the bag changes and there are more points involved in the bag. And so this particular bag I styled after those bags that would have come out of our homeland, out of the East.
I know, I love the generous size too. I think to myself, this is a bag that can carry everything. Everything you might need.
Yeah, I just like to say I'm happy to see that Karen's piece made it into the museum as well, because it is a stunning piece. We shared an exhibition together where Bernard was featured, and I just had to gaze at it for minutes at a time because it's so beautiful. It really is.
And the sound that the deer toenails make, or the hooves make when it's moved, is so musical too. You know, it's that very comforting, soft pitter patter.
That's the sound that was made when the world was first created.
How beautiful.
Mhm, mhm. The rattling of deer toes.
All right, so we are going to move on to the final piece, a collaboration between Karen Ann and Dawn. And just a quick note to our viewers that this will cover the topic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so this can be triggering for some folks and is certainly a sensitive topic. So if there are young children around, you may want to leave our conversation right now. So just fair warning, we're going to dive into this topic in a very beautiful and poignant way. All right, so here is Never Alone. I just love this piece so much. It has elements from both Dawn and Karen Ann. So this was, correct me if I'm wrong, or perhaps tell the story of how this got started, but this was part of an exhibit at the All My Relations Gallery in Minneapolis, right? To bring her home?
It was, but it really started before that, don't you think, Dawn?
Oh yeah, it really was. Well, Karen and I were inspired to work on a collaboration, and we weren't sure in the beginning exactly what we wanted to do. And coincidentally, I had been working on the Treaty Calico series, the first one, the honoring the strawberry, and had done my first beadwork into a painting, which I found very inspiring. And I thought, well, Karen and I could do this together. She could do the beadwork a lot easier than I can. And and we should do a piece together. And it was Karen who came up with the idea, because at the time, as I recall, the Walking with Our Sisters movement was just getting started, and Karen can tell you more about her process.
Well, Dawn's right. It was really exciting to me that Dawn Dark Mountain wanted to do a piece with me. She was an artist that I had idolized for a very long time. And I always say when I was a little baby artist, I was afraid to even say hello to her. I was so intimidated. But our friendship grew and our respect for one another grew. And when she broached the idea of doing something together, it really is a highlight for me. Concurrent with that was Walking with Our Sisters. And for people that are not familiar, briefly, the idea by Christy Belcourt was to crowdsource moccasin tops, VAMPS, VAMPs. And she was hoping to collect maybe 600 of those sets of vamps, and she wanted to put them out in an interactive installation where people could walk amongst the moccasin tops and think about those stolen sisters, those missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I know I made a pair of vamps that went on up to that exhibit, and I believe that Dawn did as well.
Yes, I did.
That was the inspiration for our collaboration then, to take that idea of the moccasin tops and really explore it through Dawn's medium of beadwork and through Dawn's exquisite use of sculptural watercolor. Can you please, Dawn, take us through the moccasins themselves?
Sure. Some time ago, I started doing pieces that kind of went beyond what a painting is, and trying to break out of the box a little bit. And actually inspired by Truman Lowe, who was a Wisconsin native sculptor, very well known. He actually was looking at my work once and said, "Your work looks three-dimensional." He said, "Maybe you could do something with that." And he is the one who got me started thinking, what could I do with that? And since that day, I have started making more or less three-dimensional watercolors. Not always, but when the subject matter suits, I will create, as in the Treaty Calico series, dimensional aspect, kind of playing off my watercolor style, which is also creates this illusion of three dimensions. So the moccasins, the tops, the vamps were our beadwork that Karen created, just as if she were going to make a pair of moccasins. And I made the moccasins out of watercolor paper and then affixed them to the background watercolor that really honors those missing and murdered Indigenous women, which at the time it was thought maybe 500, 600 women were missing or known to be murdered, and very little attention was being paid to that subject. And gosh, this was back in 2013, I think, that we worked on this together. And Karen added the strawberries to the corners, and she tells it better than I do. You want to explain the strawberry path?
Well, strawberries are so important for us. They are a symbol from the Creator that teaches us how to live in the current world, but it's also something that we're going to see when we pass from this world. They call it, some people say you die, some people say you walk on, some people say you travel west, but we say you walk that strawberry trail. And so that description of the afterlife is a great and important piece of medicine for us then and now. So that's why we chose it, I think, as a symbol for this painting. But another important symbol in this painting is the moon, our grandmother, Oxota. And so what they say about her is that, you know, it's Oxota, the moon, whether you know it or not, whether you see her or not, she's always watching over you. And that's kind of like the thing that a grandmother will do. And so I beaded those moons on my mock tops, and Dawn painted every phase of Oxota in the body of that watercolor. No matter where these girls are, this side of the strawberry trail or the other, Oxota watches over us all.
I think that's one of the most gut-wrenching and painful parts of this piece, the beauty of it and the tragedy. And I was able to visit the installation walking with our sisters in Ganawage. And, you know, you mentioned seeing 500, 600 vamps, but then to see so many of them. And it really hits home that we know this statistic. I think it's 1 in 3 Indigenous women will be assaulted in their lifetime, but to see that translated into an installation with so many vamps that have been carefully and lovingly created by women who are grieving and missing their sisters is overwhelming, really. And so, you know, I can't tell you how many times when I show this piece in our collections, folks can't quite believe that the moccasins are beaded, or that they, you know, there's a sculptural element to the watercolor. It's sort of magical in a way that it draws people in, and then to really deeply think about what this piece means and how it speaks to all of us, really.
There are so many details in this piece that people can delve into time and time again. They can visit time and time again, just like there are so many sisters that are gone from us that we can think about time and time again. One piece that I often like to point out when you look at the moccasin tops is you see that one is dark and one is light. They come from the same piece of red crushed velvet, but I used the nap in different directions so that they would have different color casts to them. That's to represent those sisters that are still with us here and those that have gone on to walk that strawberry trail. They're both ours. We think of them both, but one's in the light and the others are in the dark.
So when
Dawn,
oh, go-
I'm sorry, I just wanted to say if you can show the larger image of this.
I can do that.
Thanks. To me, Dawn made that expression in the women on the bottom in that detail, and I wish she would talk to us about that, please.
Yes, me too.
I just tried to create a sister. The piece is filled with sister symbolism. The piece on the right that you're showing are the three sisters, the sacred sisters, corn, beans, and squash. So the whole painting is full of that symbolism, but the figures I chose to represent with their shadows, because as Karen did with the moccasins, some are in the dark, some are in the light. So, we have hope that some will still be found, but I wanted to express the sorrow and despair of the women who have gone missing or been murdered, and try to evoke that in the woman's face. And she is dressed in traditional Oneida garb. And I thought it was important to have that shadow to represent those who have walked on.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. We think of them all, no matter where they are. They're still our sisters. And that's part of the name of this piece, Never Alone. Dawn and I talked about what shall we call this piece for a very long time. And we finally settled on Never Alone, because no matter which side of that trail those sisters are on, they're not alone. They're in our hearts, they're in our thoughts, they're in our prayers, and we're working for them. They're never, never alone.
So who began the piece, and then what was the transition to, or how did you work on this together, I guess, is what I'm really asking, since you live in two different places.
I know. And I think the idea came when we were washing dishes at your house in Madison, right before you moved. But a little thing like 3,000 miles won't stop us.
As I recall, Karen did the moccasin tops first, the vamps, and then I created the piece around them, and then later requested the strawberries for the corners, and incorporated those as well. And yeah, it wasn't that difficult. We communicated a lot, and the sad thing is, I'm thinking about, again, the inspiration for the piece, the Walking with Our Sisters display. They didn't get 500 or 600 pairs of vamps. They got thousands and thousands of vamps. So many, they had to ask people to stop sending them. And so this is just a small representation of the lives. Like I said in the beginning, you know, at the time it was thought 500 or 600 women whose whereabouts couldn't be explained. And it turns out there were so many more. So this piece is really important to all of us, I think.
I was proud that this was exhibited in Minneapolis at the All Our Relations Art Gallery. But I was even more proud, pardon me, that that art gallery chose to mount that exhibit during the during the Super Bowl.
Super Bowl.
Yeah, during the Super Bowl, because it's not often talked about, but trafficking of women at major events like a Super Bowl is incredibly common, all too common, and a serious, serious assault on the sanctity of feminine life. And so when that gallery had the courage to mount this display and open it Super Bowl weekend, I thought that that was an extremely impactful way to support the sisters. Every piece of artwork in that exhibit was centered around this theme: bring her home, bring her home.
I wish I had been able to see it. So I wanted to share with our audience some resources online and then books as well. If you would like to learn more about this really, really important topic, I will have these as part of our PowerPoint. And I will also have links to learn more about Karen Ann Hoffman and of course, Dawn Dark Mountain's website as well. Ladies, is there anything else that you would like to say before we end this recording?
Just my thanks to everyone who supports and advocates and caretakes for Native art. It's so important and it's so deeply appreciated.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Karen Ann. Um, it's truly an honor to work with both of you and to be able to steward a collection with your artwork in it. And I hope when it is safe to do so and the New York State Museum can once again open, I really look forward to having more of our contemporary Indigenous artworks on display, including your works. So at this point, we are going to end the recording. And thank you again for joining this conversation at the New York State Museum. Take care, everyone.
Onagitwa.